Late Wednesday night, July 15th, 2026, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky signed off on a decision that, within 24 hours, would trigger protests in the streets of Kyiv, an on-camera public challenge from the man he just fired, and the resignation of one of Ukraine's most respected drone commanders. The man who lost his job was Mykhailo Fedorov, Ukraine's 35-year-old defense minister, appointed just 6 months earlier in January. In that short window, Fedorov had become closely publicly associated with the rapid expansion of Ukraine's drone warfare program, a program that helped slow Russian advances on the battlefield, struck energy infrastructure deep inside Russian territory, and increased pressure on Russian-occupied Crimea. Within hours of his dismissal becoming public, hundreds of protesters gathered outside the presidential offices in central Kyiv, and Colonel Pavlo Yelizarov, deputy commander of Ukraine's Air Force and a widely respected drone unit commander in his own right, announced he was resigning in protest, calling the decision, in his own words, a great evil for the country's defense capability. Today, we're breaking down exactly what happened, why Fedorov's own explanation points directly at a bitter, long-simmering rivalry with Ukraine's top general, why this shakeup is happening at one of the most sensitive possible moments in the war, and why even the Kremlin is watching this unfold with visible interest. Stay to the end, because the story behind this firing reveals a genuine high-stakes power struggle at the very top of Ukraine's wartime leadership. Let's start with exactly who Mykhailo Fedorov is, and why his removal hit as hard as it did. Fedorov's dismissal came as part of a broader government reshuffle that had actually been announced days earlier on Sunday, July 13th. But it was his specific removal that generated by far the strongest public reaction. According to reporting, Fedorov spent only 6 months in the defense minister role, yet in that time became closely identified with several major shifts in how Ukraine fights this war. Promoting Ukrainian startups developing drone technology, pushing for mid-range drone strikes specifically designed to disrupt Russian war logistics inside Crimea and other occupied territory, overseeing changes to military pay structures, and working to improve frontline troop rotations. An issue that's been a persistent source of exhaustion and frustration for soldiers who've spent years without adequate relief from combat duty. The presidency, notably, gave no formal public reason for the change when it was first announced. That silence itself became part of the story, fueling speculation and anger in the immediate aftermath, before Zelensky's own subsequent comments and Fedorov's public remarks began filling in the actual picture. Now let's get into what actually seems to have driven this decision. Because once Fedorov spoke publicly, the picture became considerably clearer and considerably more dramatic than a routine personnel change. In his first public comments since being dismissed, Fedorov confirmed what had reportedly been rumored for some time: a serious ongoing clash with Ukraine's top military commander, General Oleksandr Syrsky. According to Fedorov, the core of the conflict was fairly direct. He described a situation where every initiative he proposed as defense minister began getting blocked, and said that Syrsky, despite the two men having discussed their disagreements before, was not willing to openly address those problems face to face. Fedorov went further, offering a specific account of how the standoff was ultimately resolved. According to him, Syrsky gave President Zelensky an ultimatum: fire the defense minister, or Syrsky himself would walk away from his post as Ukraine's top general. Fedorov didn't hold back in characterizing what he believed that decision actually represented, arguing that instead of focusing on how to asymmetrically overpower Russia, which he described as fundamentally Syrsky's core responsibility, the general instead found a way to split the country apart, which is where things stand today. That's an extraordinarily blunt public accusation for a recently dismissed cabinet minister to make against his country's top general, delivered openly to reporters, rather than through quiet, private diplomatic channels. It's worth pausing here to underline just how unusual this level of public confrontation actually is within Ukraine's wartime political system. According to reporting, Zelensky's parliamentary majority has largely rallied behind his wartime leadership throughout the conflict, generally approving his cabinet nominees without significant public dissent or internal division. This firing exposed something different, genuinely rare divisions, both within the military leadership and inside Zelensky's own parliamentary majority. One member of parliament from Zelensky's own party resigned specifically over Fedorov's dismissal, and notably appeared publicly alongside Fedorov at a press conference to show direct support, an unusually visible act of political defiance from within the president's own governing coalition. Separately, lawmaker Oleksandr Mereshko, also from Zelensky's party, told NPR that appointing Fedorov in the first place had been one of the best decisions Zelensky had made throughout the war, a striking public defense of a minister the president himself had just removed. Let's talk about the resignation that gave this story its most emotionally resonant headline. Because Colonel Pavlo Yelizarov's decision to step down wasn't just a symbolic gesture from a distant political ally. Yelizarov holds the position of deputy commander of Ukraine's Air Force, and he's specifically known as a prominent, respected drone unit commander in his own right, not simply an administrator. According to reporting, Yelizarov had actually been appointed to his role by Fedorov personally, and he's credited with helping a specific military unit known as Lasar's Group become one of the most effective drone units operating within Ukraine's forces. When Yelizarov announced his resignation, he didn't mince words about what he believed the consequences of Fedorov's dismissal would be. He described the decision as a great evil for the country's defense capability, according to CNN's reporting, while NPR's separate reporting quoted him describing it as a great blow to the country's defense capability. A slight variation in exact translated phrasing that both outlets agree captures the same core sentiment. Genuine alarm from a senior military officer that removing Fedorov would directly harm Ukraine's ongoing ability to defend itself. Yelizarov wasn't alone in stepping back in protest either. According to reporting, two other highly public defense ministry advisors also announced they were quitting their positions in the same window. Serhiy Bezkresnov, better known throughout Ukraine's military and tech community by his call sign Flash, and Serhiy Sternenko, an activist and prominent fundraiser who has played a significant role in supporting Ukraine's drone and equipment procurement efforts throughout the war, both resigned as well. Combined with Yelizarov's departure and the parliamentary defection mentioned earlier, that's at least 4 separate publicly visible resignations or defections triggered by a single personnel decision, a genuinely unusual cascade of institutional pushback for any government to absorb, let alone when actively managing a full-scale war. The public reaction on the streets matched the institutional turmoil. According to multiple outlets, hundreds of people, many of them young, gathered outside President Zelensky's offices in central Kyiv the day after Fedorov's dismissal became public. Protesters held signs and chanted in support of Fedorov, directing open criticism at Zelensky himself, an unusually direct form of public dissent against a wartime president who has otherwise maintained fairly consistent public approval and unity throughout most of the conflict. That detail matters. Ukraine has, for the most part, presented a remarkably unified public front throughout years of brutal war. A cabinet dismissal, significant enough to draw hundreds of protesters into the streets specifically to criticize the president, represents a genuine crack in that broader wartime unity, even if it remains, for now, focused on this one specific decision, rather than reflecting a broader collapse in support for Zelensky's overall leadership. Let's talk about the immediate political fallout inside Ukraine's government, because Zelensky's original plan for replacing Fedorov ran into trouble almost immediately. According to reporting, Zelensky had been expected to nominate Ihor Klimenko, Ukraine's sitting interior minister and a former police general with what's been described as more traditional military and administrative thinking, to take over as the new defense minister. But lawmakers reportedly suggested Zelensky's own party could not actually secure enough votes in parliament to confirm Klimenko for the role, a significant signal of just how much internal resistance this situation had generated. Faced with that political reality, the president's office was forced into a concession, announcing it would not formally put forward Klimenko's nomination after all, and would instead begin interviewing new candidates for the position. According to reporting, Zelensky spent much of that day in direct talks with his chief of staff, Kyirylo Budanov, the former head of Ukraine's military intelligence agency, specifically trying to coordinate a path out of the political turmoil the firing had created. That's a notable detail on its own. A sitting president needing to actively manage and contain the fallout from a single cabinet dismissal, to the point of abandoning his initial preferred replacement candidate within days of the original decision. It's worth adding some balance here, too, because Fedorov's removal wasn't universally condemned, even amid the visible backlash. According to reporting, Zelensky's own comments prior to the dismissal suggested that disagreements between the defense ministry and Ukraine's broader military leadership had become a central, unresolved concern, framing this as a decision rooted in addressing genuine institutional dysfunction rather than simply removing a popular official for arbitrary reasons. And in Moscow, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov offered his own characteristically dismissive take on the entire situation, telling reporters bluntly that it doesn't make any difference who the Ukrainian defense minister is. That comment is worth including specifically because of what it reveals, or perhaps deliberately obscures. Fedorov had played a direct, publicly documented role in shaping and accelerating Ukraine's attack drone program, specifically targeting Russia's own interior, making Peskov's dismissive framing feel less like genuine indifference and more like an attempt to downplay the significance of a program that has, according to multiple reports, genuinely disrupted Russian military logistics and infrastructure. Now, let's talk about why the timing of this entire episode matters so much, because this isn't unfolding during a quiet lull in the war. According to CNN's reporting, June 2026 was recorded as the deadliest month for Ukrainian civilians since April 2022, according to the United Nations, an increase driven specifically by long-range Russian missile strikes, hitting residential buildings in urban areas. That grim milestone sits directly in the background of this entire political crisis. Ukraine is simultaneously managing one of the deadliest stretches of civilian casualties in the war's recent history, while also absorbing a significant, publicly messy leadership shakeup at the exact ministry responsible for procuring and developing the drone technology that's played such a central role in Ukraine's ability to fight back. Separate reporting adds another layer of complexity to the timing. According to Financial World's coverage, Ukraine is currently navigating pressure on two distinct fronts simultaneously, maintaining the kind of offensive drone innovation Fedorov had become known for, while also urgently working to strengthen its own depleted air defenses, with Zelensky continuing to press allies for additional support, including more Patriot interceptors specifically capable of countering advanced Russian ballistic missiles. In other words, this leadership crisis is unfolding at precisely the moment Ukraine can least afford institutional distraction and internal division, right in the middle of a sustained, deadly Russian bombardment campaign against Ukrainian civilians, and right as the country's air defense capacity is already under visible strain. There's also a genuinely striking irony buried in the broader context of this story, one that multiple outlets picked up on directly. According to the Washington Post's own headline framing, Fedorov's ouster is happening specifically at a moment when Ukraine is scoring meaningful victories on the front line, prompting the very protests now unfolding in Kyiv, driven by fear that removing him could jeopardize that ongoing progress. The New York Times captured the same tension even more directly in its own coverage, framing the story as Ukraine having been on a roll militarily, only for a clash over fundamental war strategy to suddenly explode into public view. That's a genuinely unusual dynamic for a wartime government to be navigating, managing a serious internal leadership crisis at precisely the moment its broader military strategy appears to be working. It suggests this conflict between Fedorov and General Syrskyi wasn't simply about underperformance or battlefield failure. It appears to have been a fundamentally different kind of disagreement, a clash over strategic vision and institutional control, playing out even as Ukraine's actual combat results on the ground were trending in a positive direction. Let's also touch on the Wall Street Journal's framing of Fedorov's own conduct following his dismissal, because it adds an important layer to understanding just how unusual this entire episode has been. According to the Journal's coverage, Fedorov's public comments following his ouster amounted to what they described as a rare challenge directed at Zelensky himself. Cabinet officials in most governments, and especially in a wartime government that has generally prioritized public unity, don't typically respond to their own dismissal by publicly and specifically naming the general they believe orchestrated it, laying out a detailed account of an internal ultimatum, and accusing that same general of splitting the country apart. That Fedorov chose to do exactly that, on the record, to multiple reporters, tells you a great deal about how seriously he believes this decision will damage Ukraine's broader war effort. Serious enough that he was willing to risk the kind of public, direct confrontation with Zelensky's administration that Ukrainian officials have largely avoided throughout years of war. So where does this actually leave Ukraine's defense ministry and its broader drone program going forward? As of this recording, the specific identity of Fedorov's permanent replacement remains unresolved, with Zelensky's office actively interviewing new candidates after abandoning its initial plan to nominate Ihor Klimenko. That uncertainty itself carries real operational risk. Fedorov's 6-month tenure was specifically defined by speed, rapid procurement decisions, fast-moving partnerships with Ukrainian drone startups, and quick adaptation of new tactics like mid-range strikes on Russian logistics. A prolonged leadership vacuum, or a successor with a fundamentally different, more traditional approach, could meaningfully slow the pace of exactly the kind of innovation that's been credited with helping Ukraine hold the line and even go on the offensive in certain sectors of the front. On the military side, the loss of Yelizarov as deputy commander of the Air Force, alongside advisors like Beskresnov and Sternenko, represents a genuine reduction in institutional expertise at a moment when that expertise is arguably needed more than ever, given Ukraine's simultaneous struggles with civilian casualties from Russian missile strikes and strained air defense stockpiles. Let's also think about what this means for the underlying power dynamic between Ukraine's civilian defense leadership and its top military command going forward. If Fedorov's own account is accurate, that General Syrskyi effectively forced Zelensky to choose between the two of them, this episode represents a significant demonstration of just how much influence Ukraine's top general currently holds within the broader wartime power structure, influence apparently substantial enough to force out a popular, publicly successful cabinet minister rather than the other way around. That's a meaningful signal for anyone trying to understand where real decision-making power actually sits within Ukraine's wartime government right now, and it raises a genuinely open question about whether future civilian defense ministry initiatives, whatever they may be, will face similar resistance from military leadership going forward, or whether this specific clash was a unique, personality-driven conflict unlikely to repeat itself under a new minister. It's worth putting this specific leadership shakeup into the context of Ukraine's broader pattern of high-level military and political dismissals throughout the war, because this isn't the first time Zelensky has made a dramatic personnel change under pressure. Back in August 2024, Zelensky fired the commander of Ukraine's Air Force, Lieutenant General Mykhailo Fedorov, just 4 days after an American-supplied F-16 fighter jet crashed during a Russian bombardment, killing the pilot. That earlier dismissal came amid public controversy over whether the F-16 had actually been mistakenly downed by Ukraine's own Patriot air defense system, a claim a member of parliament had made publicly and that the Air Force never directly denied. Zelensky's stated justification at the time was framed around protecting personnel and strengthening command-level accountability. What's notable when you place these two episodes side by side is how different the underlying dynamics actually are. The 2024 Oleszczuk dismissal followed a specific, tragic operational failure, a dead pilot, and unanswered questions about friendly fire. And it didn't generate anywhere near the level of public protest or institutional resignation that Fedorov's ouster has produced. This latest crisis, by contrast, isn't tied to any single battlefield failure or tragic incident at all. It's rooted entirely in an internal power struggle over strategy and control between a popular, innovation-focused civilian minister and Ukraine's top general, which may help explain why the public and institutional reaction this time has been so much more intense, protests, resignations, and a parliamentary revolt compared to the more contained fallout from the 2024 dismissal. It's also worth understanding a bit more about General Oleksandr Syrsky's position within Ukraine's broader command structure, since he sits at the center of Fedorov's public accusations. Syrsky has served as Ukraine's top military commander, effectively the country's most senior general overseeing overall military strategy, since being appointed to replace his predecessor in a separate earlier leadership change during the war. He's generally been viewed as representing a more traditional, top-down military command approach, in contrast to Fedorov's reputation as a tech-forward innovator willing to bypass slower, conventional procurement and strategic processes in favor of faster, startup-style experimentation with drone technology. That contrast in institutional style and philosophy, rapid civilian-led innovation versus traditional top-down military command, appears to be exactly the fault line that ultimately produced this specific clash, according to Fedorov's own account of initiatives being repeatedly blocked and disagreements going unresolved through direct conversation. Before wrapping up, it's worth being clear about where the specific quotes and details in this video come from, since a story this politically sensitive benefits from careful sourcing. Fedorov's direct account of the Syrsky ultimatum and his description of blocked initiatives come from his own on-the-record comments to reporters, as captured by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Colonel Yelizarov's resignation statement is drawn from his own Facebook announcement, reported independently by both CNN and NPR, which offered slightly different English translations of his exact wording while agreeing on the core substance. The parliamentary vote count difficulty regarding Ihor Klimenko's potential nomination, along with Zelensky's meetings with Mykhailo Fedorov, come from the Irish Times' reporting, citing aides to the president directly. Where outlets differed slightly in translation or emphasis, we've noted that rather than presenting a single version as the definitive, word-for-word record, since this story is still developing rapidly, and Ukrainian officials have not released a single unified public statement covering every detail discussed here, there's a broader governance question worth sitting with as we close this out, because it extends well beyond Fedorov, Yelizarov, or even Syrsky individually. Wartime governments almost always face an inherent tension between fast-moving, innovative civilian leadership and more cautious, hierarchical military command structures. And how that tension gets resolved often ends up shaping the trajectory of a war far more than any single battlefield engagement. Fedorov's brief 6-month tenure was defined by exactly the kind of rapid, unconventional decision-making that modern drone warfare seems to reward: quick partnerships with startups, fast procurement cycles, and a willingness to experiment with new tactics like mid-range strikes on occupied territory. Syrsky's institutional position, by contrast, represents the kind of centralized, top-down military authority that traditional command structures are built around. Neither approach is inherently right or wrong in isolation, but when the two collide as directly and publicly as they just did in Kyiv, the resolution of that collision sends a signal to everyone else inside Ukraine's government and military about which approach is likely to prevail going forward. Whether Ukraine's next defense minister leans toward continuing Fedorov's fast-moving innovation model or toward a more traditional, Syrsky-aligned approach, may end up telling us as much about the future direction of Ukraine's war effort as any individual frontline development in the weeks ahead. Let's go back to where we started, late on a Wednesday night, a signature on a dismissal order. By the next morning, hundreds of protesters outside the presidential offices in Kyiv. By the same day, a respected Air Force deputy commander, a man Fedorov himself had personally appointed, announcing his resignation and calling the decision a great evil for the country's defense capability. 2 more advisors walking away, a member of parliament from Zelensky's own party quitting in solidarity, And at the center of it all, a 35-year-old former defense minister publicly and directly accusing Ukraine's top general of choosing to split the country apart rather than focus on the war itself. This isn't a story about a routine cabinet reshuffle. It's a story about a genuine public fracture at the highest levels of Ukraine's wartime leadership, unfolding at the exact moment the country is absorbing its deadliest civilian casualty month since April 2022. And right as its own battlefield momentum had, by multiple accounts, actually been trending in its favor. Thank you for watching. If this breakdown helped you understand exactly what triggered this crisis and why it matters so much right now, make sure to like the video and drop a comment letting us know what stood out most, whether it's Fedorov's direct public accusation against General Syrsky, Colonel Yelizarov's resignation, or the fact that Zelensky's own party couldn't secure enough votes for his first choice of replacement. Subscribe if you want to keep tracking how this leadership crisis resolves and who Ukraine ultimately chooses as its next defense minister. Because, based on how fast this story has already moved, the next chapter is likely just days away.